Thanks for joining me. My name is Sean Egglestone, and I'm a registered dietitian. And today, we're going to be looking at why low carbohydrate diets tend to perform better than high carbohydrate diets in different scientific studies. Now, this is an important video, and there's going to be a lot of useful content, so I highly recommend you watch the video in its entirety. But just to get us started, if you've ever had a conversation with someone about high and low carbohydrate diets, or you've read a blog post or seen a presentation, oftentimes what they'll say is that these low carb diets perform better than the high carbohydrate diets. People lose more weight, their lipid panel gets better, their insulin sensitivity improves. And today we're going to look at the flaws in these studies and why they're actually showing it. And we're going to go over how I actually analyze a diet to determine if it's healthy or not. And that'll provide you with some useful tools that you can use at home to look at your own diet. How can you analyze your own diet and determine if you're consuming a healthy diet or if there's ways that you can improve? So I do have some talking points off screen that I'll be referring to. And then later in the presentation, we're going to skip to some screenshots, and I'm going to go over how do I actually analyze a diet? How do I determine if something is healthy or not? So one of the first things to keep in mind when we're looking at these studies is there's no set definition of high carb or low fat. There's no percentage that's standardized across the industry. So it really depends on how the scientist conducting the study wants to define it. So sometimes they'll say the high carb group has to consume 35% of their calories or fewer from fat, because that's really what they're looking at. They're looking at a high carb, low fat diet versus a high fat, low carb diet. So I might use these terms interchangeably, but just know that if it's a high carb, it's a low fat. So there's no real set definition on low fat. It could be 20% in these studies, it could be 35%, and that's something to keep in mind. So if you're talking with someone or reading a blog post, always ask yourself, what is the percentage of calories? What is the macronutrient breakdown? And that's really what we're talking about here is these studies that focus on macronutrients. So what that means is, what percentage of calories are they getting from carbs, protein, and fat? And unfortunately, when we look at macronutrients or we look at food simply based on the macronutrients, we're missing the whole picture. What I care about as a dietitian is what kinds of food are they actually consuming? What kind of foods are you consuming? We're talking about fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans. What are you actually taking in? And so these macronutrient studies really don't talk about what they're eating. It just talks about sort of how the calories are distributed in their diet. And it really misses the whole picture of what it means to be healthy. Another point to keep in mind is it really depends on what their macronutrient ratio is when they're starting the diet versus when they're ending the diet. So if the macronutrient ratio doesn't change much from baseline, then you're not going to see a huge difference in health. Also, if the macronutrient ratio isn't a huge difference between the low carb group and the high carb group, you're not going to see a huge difference either. So, for example, one study I looked at, the low carb group had 35% of their calories from fat, and the high carb group had less than 30% of their calories from fat. So it's not a big enough difference. So the results are going to be a wash. One of the limitations with studies that look at macronutrients only is they're not looking at the whole picture of what it means to be healthy. When I work with clients in the hospital or in practice, I am looking at the total health picture. So what's their Alzheimer's disease risk? What's their stroke risk? What can they do to improve their diabetes? How can they feed their good gut bacteria and improve their immune system? So I'm looking at the whole health picture, and oftentimes with these studies, they're merely focusing on things like weight loss, lipid panel, and maybe insulin sensitivity for diabetes. And it really doesn't cover the whole picture of what it means to be healthy. So let's dive right into this. We're going to skip to some screenshots, and I'm going to show you exactly how I analyze a diet and what I look for when we're looking at these studies. How can you tell what they're actually eating, and how do we know if they're following a healthy diet or not? Before we can dive into the actual studies and how I examine a diet, it's important to have a good understanding of macronutrient pairing. So when I look at food, I typically divide it up into two categories: plant foods and animal foods. Plant foods being fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, nuts, and seeds. And animal foods being dairy, eggs, and meat. And with the exception of dairy, carbohydrates only come from plant foods. And fiber is a type of carbohydrate. So a diet that's centered around plant foods is typically the healthiest diet that you can follow. It's going to be high in carbohydrates, and it's also going to be high in fiber, because you can't have whole, intact carbohydrates without having a large amount of fiber. Now, what you'll see in these studies is they have a lot of carbs, but they're not going to have a lot of fiber. And that means that most of their carbohydrates are coming from things like chips, crackers, cookies, pastries, desserts, white flour, and white sugar. And these are going to provide carbs without much fiber. And we'll take a look at how we can examine these diets in the study. Now, another important point is that animal foods tend to be moderate in protein and have a fair amount of fat. So diets that are high in fat typically are centered around things like dairy and cheese, milk, and if they're really high in fat, like a ketogenic diet, they're going to have a lot of oils and whipping cream and butter and other forms of processed fat. One of the ways that I determine if a diet is healthy is I look at the ratio of carbohydrates to fiber. So for example, spinach. Spinach is really high in fiber, so for every 2 grams of carbs, you're going to get 1 gram of fiber. Moving down the list here, apples, 6 grams of carbs to 1 gram of fiber. White bread's much worse. White bread is 11 grams of carbs to 1 gram of fiber, and then pepperoni pizza, 13 grams of carbs to 1 gram of fiber. So let's go ahead and take a look at this study and determine what could these participants possibly be eating. This is the main study that we're going to look at today. It's called Carbohydrate Restriction Has a More Favorable Impact on the Metabolic Syndrome Than a Low-Fat Diet. So what this means in layman terms is, what's better for your health? Carb restriction or fat restriction? And what they find in this study is that carb restriction is better for your health than fat restriction. And I'm going to show you how they came up with that conclusion and why it's incorrect. So one of the first things I look at when looking at studies, or one of the questions you should ask when you're talking about diets like this, is what's the macronutrient ratio breakdown? So here, the carb-restricted group has a macronutrient ratio of 12% calories coming from carbs, 59% from fat, and 28% from protein. Now, typically it's listed as carbs, protein, fat, but it really depends. Here they list it as carbs, fat, and protein. And then the low-fat group here had a macronutrient ratio of 56% carbs, 24% fat, and 20% protein. So I'm not going to go through all the details of this study. One of the things we are going to look at is this sheet here. This is going to tell us what these people are actually eating. So if you remember to what I just said about the carbohydrate to fiber ratio, what we notice, this is the low carb group here, and this right here, these two columns are the low fat group. So what we notice initially is that the calories were restricted in both groups. And that's going to let us know, well, why did these people have health improvements on this diet? And oftentimes a big part of their health improvement, whether it's weight loss or whether it's lipid panel improvement, is simply because they're restricting calories. The other thing that I look at here is their carbohydrate to fiber ratio. So here they have 208 grams of carbohydrates, but they only consume 17 grams of fiber. And that's an important point because the average female needs to consume 25 grams of fiber per day, and the average male needs to consume 38 grams of fiber per day. So if you average that out, the average person should consume roughly 31 grams of fiber per day, and yet these people are only consuming 16 to 17 grams of fiber per day. What that means is they're consuming a diet that's not high in fiber, but it is high in carbohydrates. And if you remember back to my macronutrient slide, the only way that they can consume carbs without consuming adequate fiber is to consume diets that are high in pastries, cookies, soda, and other junk foods that are not healthy for us. So referring back to this Excel sheet, during this study, they had a carbohydrate to fiber ratio of 12 to 1. So for every 208 grams of carbs, they had 17 grams of fiber. So what kind of foods could they be consuming? Well, when we go down the list here, to get a ratio of 12 to 1, we would have to eat something like white bread, potato chips, barbecued Fritos, French fries, Belvita cookies, and pepperoni pizza. These all have a carb to fiber ratio of roughly 12 to 1. One other important point to look at here is for every 208 grams of carbs, they had 17 grams of fiber. So if they ate all of their carbohydrates from French fries, barbecued Fritos, and potato chips, they would have actually eaten more fiber than they did on this study. So what that tells me is they consumed at some point during the day added sugar. So based on my calculations, they consumed somewhere between 5 additional teaspoons of added sugar up to, at worst, 29 teaspoons of added sugar per day. So again, these macronutrients don't really tell us what they're eating. They just tell us how their calories are distributed. But you can tell through a little bit of more detailed analysis that we can actually get a potentially good idea of what these people were eating. Now here on nutritiondata.com, I put together a mock diet. Now before we actually look at what these participants possibly consumed, I want to show you that this diet here that I put together for you has the exact same macronutrient ratio as this study. So 56% carbs, 24% fat, 20% protein. They consumed roughly the same amount of calories as the high carb, low fat group, the same amount of protein, the same amount of fat, the same amount of fiber, roughly 17 grams of fiber, and their saturated fat and cholesterol was all the same. So this diet could potentially mirror exactly what the high carb group was eating. So what were these people eating? And this will let us know why they didn't perform better. Why did the low carb group perform better than the high carb group? Well, for breakfast, maybe they had a bowl of Fruit Loops and they had a banana. And then for lunch, they decided they wanted to have a chicken sandwich on white bread with a little bit of mayonnaise, some tomato, and some lettuce. And then on the side, they had an apple. And then for dinner, they were in a rush. They didn't have time to cook. And so they had 2 slices of Domino's pepperoni pizza. So if they consumed this diet here, that would have landed them exactly in the group that they were at. And that lets us know why they didn't perform better. So there you go. That's why the high carb group didn't do as good as the low carb group, because they weren't eating very healthy. And we know that for a few reasons. The first is we looked at their carbohydrate to fiber ratio. The other thing we looked at was we matched up their macronutrient ratios, their cholesterol intake, their saturated fat intake, and their calories with a mock diet. And I showed you exactly what potentially they were eating. So this brings to mind a few important points that I'm going to refer to off screen here. The fact is, both groups actually saw improvement. Why is that? And I think that's because both groups reduced their calorie intake. The low carb group reduced their calorie intake by about 800 calories, and the high carb group reduced their calorie intake by 500 calories. But what you notice is from the start of the study to the end of the study, their macronutrient ratios didn't change very much, nor did their fiber intake. So what that tells me is the quality of the diet, the types of the food that they consumed didn't change. All that changed was their portion sizes, and that's why they actually saw some benefit. And that's sort of the scary point, is that Both of these groups, especially the high carb group, actually saw improvements in their weight loss, their lipid panel, and a few other health markers. And that's often because they didn't consume as many calories. It has nothing to do with the quality of their diet or even the carbohydrates. But it just goes to show how bad the standard American diet is, that you can literally eat white bread, Fruit Loops, and Domino's pizza and still have a health benefit. Now, one question you might be asking me is, well, Sean, why didn't we go over the low carb group? And if you've seen my video on the ketogenic diet, or you've seen I have a paper up on my website, seantherd.com, under frequently asked questions, as well as on the main page, it goes over why I don't recommend a high-fat diet. And you'll notice that in this group, they consumed roughly 9 grams of fiber, so they're simply not taking in enough fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and beans. And I'm never going to recommend a diet that is devoid of those excellent carbohydrate sources. So just to reiterate a couple additional points, the macronutrients don't tell us what they're eating. They only tell us how they're dividing up their calories, and it's not a good indication of health. So when you're having conversations with people about these types of diets, just keep in mind the low carb group does better than the high carb group, not because carbs are bad, and not because a high carb diet is bad, and not because a low carb diet is good. It's just that it's better than what they were doing originally, and it really depends on where your carbs are coming from. Another reason why I wouldn't recommend the low carb diet is because it could potentially be difficult to follow. Who wants to limit the amount of fruit that they take in? Everybody loves pasta, rice and beans. These are very, very healthy foods. So a lot of the foods that you enjoy, you're not going to be able to have on a very low carb diet, such as the one in this study here. Keep in mind, these studies aren't about determining what type of diet is actually healthy. The only thing that these studies are looking at is which diet is better than another diet. It's not saying that the low carb diet is actually healthy to follow. All the scientists are saying is that the low carb diet performed better than the high carb diet. It's not saying that it was actually healthy. When you look at the change in the weight loss, the improvements in the lipid panel, and even the improvements in their hemoglobin A1C, what you know from the actual data is that the health benefits that the participants achieved on the low carbohydrate were actually not that substantial. It's just that they were better than the high carb group. So keep that in mind. When someone says a low carb diet is better than a high carb diet, they're not saying that a low carb diet is healthy and that it will have drastic improvements on your health. The only thing that they're saying is that it just performs slightly better, but statistically significantly better than a high carbohydrate diet. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you found this video helpful. If you're watching this on YouTube and you have any questions or comments, you can post them down below, or you can head over to my website, seantherd.com, and you can go to the Contact Me page and send any questions my way. Also, I have videos posted on the Educate Yourself drop-down menu, and my ketogenic paper is under the frequently asked questions if you want to check that out as well. Thanks, guys, for watching. Cheers.